Welcome to Mystery Stories, a quiet corner where gentle village life meets intriguing secrets. Here you will discover cozy mysteries filled with clever observations, hidden motives, and unexpected truths. Settle in with a warm cup of tea and let each story guide you through peaceful lanes, old churches, and whispered gossip, where even the smallest detail may reveal a mystery waiting patiently to be uncovered. Chapter 1. People in a quiet village often believe that nothing unusual ever happened after dark. Yet it was precisely during those gentle, silent hours that the smallest mysteries sometimes began to unfold. St. Briarwood was the sort of village where the lanes curved softly between hedgerows, where cottages leaned comfortably beside small gardens, and where the church bell had marked the rhythm of daily life for more than 2 centuries. Visitors often remarked upon the peacefulness of the place, though anyone who had lived in a village long enough understood that calm surfaces occasionally concealed far more interesting currents beneath. Miss Marple had arrived in St. Briarwood 3 days earlier to spend a pleasant visit with Mrs. Harriet Linton, an old acquaintance whose warm cottage stood just across the narrow lane from the village churchyard. The cottage itself was comfortable and bright, with lace curtains that glowed softly in the evening light and shelves filled with teacups collected over many years. From the sitting room window, one could see the old stone church rising beyond the small iron gate of the graveyard, its tall tower outlined gently against the evening sky. It was a particularly calm evening when the matter first occurred. The air carried that quiet stillness that settles over English villages once supper dishes have been cleared and lamps begin glowing in cottage windows. Somewhere down the lane, a dog barked once, and then settled again. The church bell had rung the hour not long before, leaving the night peaceful and undisturbed. Inside Mrs. Linton's cottage, the last cups of tea had been cleared away, and Miss Marple had excused herself for the evening with her usual gentle politeness. She climbed the narrow staircase slowly, pausing once to admire the neat row of framed photographs that lined the wall. Mrs. Linton's late husband appeared in several of them, smiling proudly beside garden roses or holding a fishing rod beside the village stream. Miss Marple reached the guest bedroom and began her quiet preparations for the night. She always preferred a few calm moments before sleep, and the small window beside the bed offered a pleasant view of the churchyard. The moon had risen high by then, spreading a pale silver light across the gravestones and the narrow gravel paths that wound between them. For several minutes she stood by the window, simply enjoying the stillness. The old church looked particularly dignified beneath the moonlight. Its stone walls carried the faint marks of age, yet the building stood solid and reassuring, as it had for generations of villagers who had gathered there for weddings, christenings, and quiet Sunday mornings. It was while Miss Marple watched this peaceful scene that something rather unusual occurred. The small side door of the church moved. At first it was only the slightest motion, a slow shifting of the dark wooden panel as though a gentle breeze had nudged it. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, studying the door with quiet curiosity. She had walked through the churchyard earlier that afternoon and distinctly remembered the caretaker locking that very door. Yet now the door slowly opened. The movement was careful, almost cautious. It did not swing wide, but eased inward only a little, leaving a narrow, dark gap between the door and the frame. For a moment, nothing else happened. The churchyard remained silent. Then, a figure appeared. It was little more than a shadow slipping through the opening, but Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, even in the dim light. The figure paused briefly beside the door, as though listening, then stepped onto the gravel path that led between the gravestones. The person moved quietly, keeping close to the darker edges of the church wall. There was something deliberate about the pace, neither hurried nor relaxed. The shadow crossed the path and continued along the row of old yew trees that bordered the far side of the churchyard. Within a few moments, the figure disappeared into the deeper darkness near the stone wall at the back of the grounds. The side door remained open for several seconds before slowly closing again. Miss Marple continued standing by the window, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. She had lived long enough to know that unexpected sights rarely explain themselves immediately. Instead, she watched the churchyard a little longer, noting how still everything seemed once more. Nothing else moved. Eventually, she closed the curtains and prepared for sleep, though the quiet image of that opening door remained gently in her thoughts. The following morning brought bright sunshine and the pleasant activity that always accompanied the village's daily routines. The bakery opened early, releasing the warm smell of fresh bread into the lane, and several villagers gathered outside the small shop, exchanging their usual cheerful greetings. Miss Marple and Mrs. Linton walked there together after breakfast, carrying a small basket for pastries. Mrs. Linton greeted nearly everyone they passed, for she had lived in St. Briarwood for many years and knew each neighbor's habits quite well. As they stepped into the bakery, they found two other ladies already engaged in conversation near the counter. Mrs. Edith Penbury was speaking with the baker's wife in a tone that suggested mild curiosity. "I'm sure I heard footsteps near the church quite late last night," Mrs. Penbury was saying. "Quite unusual for this village at that hour." The baker's wife looked surprised. "Footsteps, you say? That is odd." The church was certainly closed. Miss Marple listened quietly while selecting a small loaf from the shelf. Mrs. Linton smiled politely. "Perhaps someone walking home a little late." Mrs. Penbury shook her head slowly. "No, I'm certain it was inside the churchyard. I heard gravel moving as though someone was walking among the graves." Miss Marple said nothing at first, though her mind gently noted the remark. They completed their purchase and stepped outside into the bright morning sunlight. The village green looked cheerful, with sparrows hopping across the grass and the postman cycling slowly along the lane. Mrs. Linton laughed softly. Mrs. Penbury has always had a talent for hearing mysterious sounds. Miss Marple gave a thoughtful smile. "It is interesting, though," she said gently. "One does not usually expect visitors at the church after midnight." Mrs. Linton looked mildly surprised. "You heard something as well?" Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "No sound, I'm afraid. Only a small observation." Mrs. Linton waited, but Miss Marple did not elaborate further. Instead, they continued along the lane until they reached the tea shop, where several villagers had gathered near the front window, enjoying the morning light. The vicar himself happened to be seated there, stirring sugar into a cup of tea. Mrs. Linton greeted him warmly. "Good morning, Reverend Clark. I hear there were rumors of late-night visitors at the church." The vicar chuckled kindly. "Oh dear, village imagination at work again. I assure you the church was quite empty." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "You are certain the side door remained locked all night?" The vicar nodded with quiet confidence. "Absolutely. Mr. Graves is very careful about such things." Miss Marple accepted the answer politely, though she did not immediately speak again. Instead, she lifted her teacup and gazed out the window toward the distant church tower. Her thoughts moved calmly over the details she had seen. The slow movement of the door, the quiet figure slipping across the path, the certainty with which someone had entered and left without drawing attention. People often assumed villages were simple places where everyone knew everything that occurred. Yet Miss Marple had always believed the opposite was often true. In places where life appeared most predictable, small secrets sometimes moved unnoticed. Mrs. Penbury soon joined their table, bringing fresh conversation with her. "I told Mrs. Carter I heard something unusual last night," she said. "She insisted it must have been the wind." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "The wind rarely opens doors so carefully," she observed gently. Mrs. Penbury blinked. "Doors?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, her expression thoughtful and calm. "Oh, yes." The small side door of the church appeared to open for a short while. The ladies exchanged surprised glances. "Well," Mrs. Penbury said at last, "that is certainly odd." Miss Marple did not argue or insist upon the matter. She simply sipped her tea and listened while the conversation drifted to other topics. Yet quietly, behind her gentle smile, her mind had already begun arranging the pieces of a small puzzle. A locked church, a door that opened, a shadow that moved carefully through the churchyard at midnight. And as Miss Marple sat peacefully among the morning chatter of St. Briarwood, smiling gently as she stirred her tea, She knew with quiet certainty that she had just witnessed the very first shadow of a mystery. Chapter 2. There is a particular sort of conversation that only occurs when several village ladies gather around a teapot in the afternoon. It begins harmlessly enough with remarks about the weather, the quality of the scones, or the state of someone's roses, yet it rarely remains there for long. Before many minutes pass, the talk gently drifts towards small observations about neighbors, curious habits, or events that seem just slightly out of place. Such conversations, though polite and cheerful on the surface, often carry more information than any formal inquiry ever could. It was precisely such a gathering that took place the following afternoon in Mrs. Harriet Linton's comfortable sitting room. The room itself was bright and welcoming. Sunlight poured softly through the lace curtains, and a small arrangement of late summer flowers rested on the center table beside the teapot. The scent of freshly baked biscuits lingered pleasantly in the air, and the quiet ticking of the mantel clock gave the room a calm, steady rhythm. Miss Marple sat comfortably near the window, her teacup resting lightly in her hands while she listened to the cheerful chatter unfolding around her. Mrs. Linton moved about the room with quiet efficiency, pouring tea and offering small plates of biscuits to the guests. Two other ladies had arrived shortly after luncheon. Mrs. Edith Penberry, who had lived in St. Briarwood nearly all her life, sat upright in the armchair nearest the fireplace. She possessed a natural enthusiasm for village news and rarely allowed a conversation to pass without contributing at least one interesting remark. Across from her sat Mrs. Clara Weatherby, a soft-spoken woman with gentle manners who nevertheless had a sharp memory for the details of village life. The conversation had begun with entirely ordinary matters. The vicar's upcoming charity supper was discussed, followed by a brief exchange about the new roses planted along the churchyard wall. Yet after a few minutes, Mrs. Penberry leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to signal that something more interesting was about to be shared. "I must say," she began thoughtfully, "there has been something rather peculiar about the church lately." Mrs. Linton looked up with mild curiosity while placing a plate of biscuits on the table. "Peculiar in what way?" Mrs. Penberry glanced briefly toward the window, as though confirming that no one else might overhear. "Well, it may be nothing at all, of course," she continued, "but I happened to notice something odd 2 evenings ago when I was returning home from my sister's cottage." Miss Marple lifted her eyes slightly, though her expression remained calm and attentive. Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward with polite interest. "What sort of thing did you notice?" Mrs. Penberry reached for her teacup and spoke slowly, as though recalling the moment carefully. The small side door of the church was standing slightly open. Mrs. Linton paused. "Open? That is unusual." Mrs. Penberry nodded firmly. "Exactly what I thought. Mr. Graves is normally very particular about locking everything once evening prayers are finished." Miss Marple spoke gently. "And this was after dark?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Penberry replied. "Quite late, actually. I remember the moon had already risen." Mrs. Linton frowned thoughtfully. "That does seem odd. Mr. Graves has been caretaker for years, and I have never known him to leave the church unlocked." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, though her mind quietly turned over the remark. The image of the slowly opening door from the previous night returned clearly to her memory. Mrs. Weatherby added softly, "Perhaps he simply forgot." Mrs. Penberry shook her head with surprising certainty. "Oh, I doubt that very much. Lionel Graves may be quiet, but he is extremely careful about church matters." Miss Marple placed her teacup gently on the table. "Has he seemed himself lately?" she asked. The question was asked so casually that it did not immediately draw attention, yet Mrs. Penberry considered it seriously. "Well," she said slowly, "now that you mention it, he has seemed rather distracted." Mrs. Linton glanced up. "Distracted?" "Yes," Mrs. Penberry continued. "I passed him outside the grocer's shop earlier this week, and he seemed quite preoccupied. Barely noticed me at all." Mrs. Weatherby nodded thoughtfully. "I noticed something similar during Sunday service. He nearly forgot to bring out the hymn books." Mrs. Linton looked mildly surprised. That would be unlike him. Miss Marple listened quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Small details often revealed far more than people realized. A man who had performed the same routine duties for years rarely became careless without reason. Mrs. Penberry leaned forward again, clearly pleased to have gathered the group's attention. "And there is something else," she added. Mrs. Linton smiled patiently. "There always is." "Well," Mrs. Pemberry continued, lowering her voice slightly, "I have seen someone walking near the church on several evenings this week." Miss Marple raised her eyes slightly. "Someone from the village?" Mrs. Pemberry hesitated. "I could not say. It was rather dark each time, but it struck me as unusual." Mrs. Weatherby spoke quietly. "The churchyard path is not commonly used at night." "Exactly," Mrs. Penberry said. Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful but pleasant. "People do sometimes develop sudden interests in old buildings," she said gently. Mrs. Penberry chuckled. "Oh, perhaps. Though it seemed less like sightseeing and more like someone searching for something." Mrs. Linton looked puzzled. "Searching?" "Well," Mrs. Penberry explained, "the figure appeared to move slowly along the church wall, almost as though examining it." Miss Marple allowed a brief silence to settle while she considered the remark. Then she asked calmly, "And Mr. Graves has the only key to the side door?" Mrs. Linton nodded. "As far as I know, yes. The vicar leaves such matters entirely to him." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window where the church tower could be seen rising above the trees in the distance. Church caretakers often knew every small detail of a building. Hidden cupboards, loose stones, forgotten corners that no one else ever noticed. If someone had been entering the church quietly at night, they would almost certainly require the cooperation of the man who kept its keys. Mrs. Weatherby broke the silence with a soft laugh. "It is probably something entirely harmless." "Most likely," Mrs. Linton agreed. Mrs. Penberry, however, was not fully convinced. "I still think it rather odd," she insisted. "A church door standing open after dark is not something one sees every day." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "No, indeed." She reached for another biscuit, though her thoughts had already moved several steps ahead of the conversation. The door opening. Footsteps in the churchyard. The caretaker behaving slightly out of character. Individually, these matters might mean nothing at all. Yet when placed beside one another, they began to form a faint pattern. Mrs. Linton soon rose to refill the teapot. "I shall ask Mr. Graves about it the next time I see him," she said cheerfully. Mrs. Penberry nodded approvingly. Yes, that would certainly clear things up. Miss Marple did not object. In fact, she seemed quite content to allow the conversation to drift toward lighter subjects. Within minutes, the ladies were discussing the village flower show and the quality of this year's strawberries. Yet even while smiling and listening politely, Miss Marple's mind continued its quiet work. People often revealed far more through their ordinary habits than through their words. If Mr. Graves had indeed been leaving the church door unlocked, there would almost certainly be a reason. And if someone had been visiting the churchyard at night, that reason might soon become clearer. The afternoon sun slowly shifted across the carpet while the conversation continued in its pleasant rhythm. Eventually, the ladies gathered their handbags and prepared to leave. Mrs. Penberry paused beside the door before stepping out into the garden. "I suppose it is all perfectly harmless," she said thoughtfully. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Quite possibly." But as she watched the ladies walk down the garden path toward the quiet village lane, Miss Marple's expression grew just slightly more thoughtful. A locked door rarely opens itself, and when it does, there is almost always someone nearby who prefers that no one should notice. Miss Marple returned slowly to her seat beside the window and looked out toward the distant churchyard. Somewhere within that old building, she suspected, a small secret had already begun to stir, and Miss Marple, her eyes thoughtful behind her gentle smile, could not help wondering whether the open door was merely the beginning of something far more troubling. Chapter 3. In villages like St. Briarwood, the smallest changes in a person's manner rarely passed entirely unnoticed. A man who had greeted neighbors cheerfully for years might suddenly seem distracted. Someone who once walked with easy confidence might begin glancing over a shoulder as though expecting interruption. Such changes were subtle, and most people overlooked them without a second thought. Yet Miss Marple had always believed that small changes in behavior were often far more revealing than dramatic events. The following afternoon brought soft sunshine and a mild breeze that carried the scent of cut grass through the narrow village lanes. After luncheon, Miss Marple suggested to Mrs. Linton that she might enjoy a quiet walk before tea. "The churchyard looks particularly pleasant this time of year," she remarked gently. Mrs. Linton agreed at once. "It certainly does. Though I must remain here for a while. Mrs. Penberry promised to bring over a jar of blackberry preserve, and she becomes terribly offended if one is not present to receive it." Miss Marple smiled kindly at this explanation and set off alone along the narrow path leading toward the church. The church of St. Briarwood stood upon slightly raised ground, surrounded by an old stone wall that had weathered many decades of English seasons. The iron gate creaked softly as Miss Marple pushed it open, stepping onto the gravel path that wound between rows of gravestones. The place possessed a peaceful dignity. Tall yew trees shaded portions of the yard, their dark branches moving gently in the breeze. Sparrows hopped between the stones, and somewhere nearby a wood pigeon cooed in the slow, patient rhythm of the countryside. Miss Marple walked slowly, pausing now and then to read the inscriptions carved upon the older stones. Some dated back more than 100 years, their lettering softened by time. It was during this quiet stroll that she noticed the man standing near the side wall of the church. Mr. Lionel Graves, the church caretaker, stood beside the very door Miss Marple had observed 2 nights earlier. He held a small ring of keys in one hand and appeared to be adjusting the brass lock. He was a thin man of middle years with narrow shoulders and careful movements. His dark coat hung loosely upon him, and his face carried the slightly pale look of someone who spent much of his time indoors. When he noticed Miss Marple approaching, he straightened quickly and offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon, madam." Miss Marple returned the greeting warmly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Graves. Such a pleasant day for a walk." "Yes, indeed," he replied, though his voice carried a faint tightness that did not quite match the calm afternoon. Miss Marple paused a few steps away, admiring the church wall as though she had simply stopped to enjoy the view. "You keep the churchyard beautifully," she said kindly. "It must require a great deal of care." Mr. Graves gave a short nod. "One does what one can." Miss Marple's eyes drifted casually toward the door beside him. It was now firmly closed, and Mr. Graves appeared to be turning the key carefully within the lock. "I imagine security is quite important for a building like this," she added lightly. Mr. Graves hesitated only a fraction of a second before answering. "Yes, very important." Miss Marple watched him with quiet interest. The keys in his hand trembled slightly as he slipped them into his coat pocket. "Churches hold many valuable things," she continued pleasantly. "Old books, memorial objects, and sometimes documents of historical interest." Mr. Graves nodded again, though his gaze shifted briefly toward the path behind Miss Marple, as if checking whether anyone else might be approaching. "That is quite true." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I happened to notice something curious the other evening." Mr. Graves looked up quickly. "Oh." The side door appeared to be open rather late. For the briefest moment, the caretaker's expression stiffened. It was a small change, easily missed by anyone less observant. But Miss Marple did not miss it. "I assure you," Mr. Graves said quickly, "the church is always locked at night." His tone was polite, yet slightly strained. Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "Perhaps I was mistaken. Moonlight can play curious tricks with one's eyes." "Yes," he said quickly, "exactly so." For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind stirred the leaves of the yew trees, and somewhere beyond the wall, a cart rolled slowly along the village lane. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger before speaking again. "You must know the church very well after so many years." Mr. Graves nodded. "I have cared for it nearly 15 years now. That is quite a responsibility. It is honest work." Miss Marple's gaze drifted briefly toward the brass handle of the door beside him. Something about it caught her attention. The handle shone brightly in the afternoon sunlight, polished so recently that it reflected the surrounding stones like a small mirror. That alone might not have seemed unusual, yet Miss Marple distinctly remembered noticing the same handle 2 days earlier while walking through the churchyard with Mrs. Linton. At that time it had appeared dull with age, its surface slightly tarnished. Now, it gleamed as though someone had polished it repeatedly. Miss Marple turned her attention back to Mr. Graves. "I imagine you must clean the church quite regularly." "Yes," he replied. "The brass fittings especially." Mr. Graves nodded quickly. "Yes, they require frequent attention." Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed they do." She did not mention that the handle appeared far more polished than necessary for ordinary cleaning. Instead, she asked gently, "Do many visitors come to the church during the week?" Mr. Graves seemed slightly uncomfortable with the question. "Very few." "Tourists, perhaps?" "Occasionally." Miss Marple considered this answer for a moment. "One sometimes hears footsteps in the churchyard late in the evening," she said lightly. Mr. Graves looked startled. "Footsteps?" "Yes. Mrs. Penberry mentioned hearing someone walking here 2 nights ago." The caretaker shifted his weight uneasily. "I am certain she must have been mistaken." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Quite possibly." Again the conversation paused. Mr. Graves seemed eager to return to his duties, glancing toward the church door as though ensuring it was properly secured. Miss Marple sensed that she had learned as much as she was likely to from further questions. "Well," she said kindly, "I shall not keep you from your work." He nodded with visible relief. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." She walked slowly along the path toward the gate, though her thoughts continued quietly behind her calm expression. A caretaker who insisted the door had never been opened. A handle polished far more than necessary. Hands that trembled slightly while locking the door. Such details might appear trivial to most people, yet Miss Marple had often observed that nervous hands usually belonged to someone who feared discovery rather than someone performing ordinary duties. As she reached the gate, she paused briefly and glanced back toward the church. Mr. Graves had already turned away and was walking toward the far side of the building, his posture slightly hunched as though burdened by some private concern. Miss Marple stepped onto the lane and began the gentle walk back toward Mrs. Linton's cottage. The village looked peaceful as ever. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the green, and the baker's delivery cart stood outside the shop. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts remained fixed upon the caretaker. People who had nothing to hide rarely became defensive over simple observations. And there was something else as well. The polished door handle suggested that the door had been opened and closed many times recently. Far more times than one would expect for a church that supposedly remained locked each night. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane, considering the matter from several angles. It was possible, of course, that Mr. Graves had a perfectly innocent explanation. Yet his nervousness suggested otherwise. By the time she reached Mrs. Linton's garden gate, Miss Marple had reached a quiet conclusion. Whatever reason existed for that door opening at night, the caretaker clearly did not wish anyone to know about it. And as Miss Marple stepped into the peaceful garden and closed the gate behind her, she found herself wondering why a man responsible for guarding a church would appear so deeply troubled by a simple question about a door. Chapter 4. In a village the size of St. Briarwood, the arrival of an unusual letter could become a topic of conversation long before the envelope had even been opened. The village post office stood beside the small grocery shop near the green, and although it was modest in size, it served as one of the most reliable sources of quiet information in the entire parish. Packages, postcards, and envelopes passed through its narrow wooden counter each morning, and with them came the small observations that villagers noticed without realizing they had done so. It was during one such ordinary morning that Miss Marple happened to hear something that stirred her curiosity once again. The day had begun pleasantly enough. Sunlight drifted softly across the hedgerows, and the lane leading toward the village green carried the gentle hum of daily activity. Mrs. Linton had suggested that they walk together to the post office after breakfast, as she wished to send a parcel to her niece in Bath. Miss Marple agreed at once, for she enjoyed observing the quiet rhythms of village life, and the short walk offered a pleasant opportunity for conversation. As they approached the post office, they could see Mrs. Carter standing behind the counter, arranging a neat row of letters into the wooden sorting rack. Mrs. Carter had served as the village postmistress for nearly 20 years, and there was very little that passed through St. Briarwood's mail without her careful attention. The bell above the door rang softly as Miss Marple and Mrs. Linton stepped inside. "Good morning," Mrs. Carter said cheerfully. "Good morning," Mrs. Linton replied. "I have a small parcel to send." While Mrs. Carter weighed the parcel and prepared the postage label, another customer entered the shop. It was Mrs. Penberry, who greeted everyone warmly before stepping up beside the counter. "I must collect my sister's letter today," she announced, though she appeared far more interested in conversation than correspondence. Mrs. Carter smiled politely while sliding a small stack of envelopes into the correct compartments. "It has been quite a busy morning," she said. "Has it?" Mrs. Penberry asked. "Oh yes," Mrs. Carter replied. "Several letters arrived from London on the early delivery." Miss Marple listened quietly while examining a small rack of postcards near the window. Mrs. Penberry leaned slightly closer to the counter. "Anyone interesting receive one?" Mrs. Carter hesitated only briefly before answering. "Well, it is a little unusual, I must admit." Mrs. Penberry's eyes brightened immediately. "In what way?" Mrs. Carter lowered her voice slightly, though there was no real secrecy in the shop. "A letter arrived this morning addressed to Mr. Lionel Graves." Miss Marple's attention shifted gently back toward the counter. Mrs. Penberry looked surprised. "Mr. Graves? The church caretaker?" "Yes," Mrs. Carter said. "From London." Mrs. Linton looked mildly curious. "That seems rather unexpected." Mrs. Carter nodded. "I thought so as well. He rarely receives letters from outside the village." Mrs. Penberry folded her arms thoughtfully. "Did it have a return address?" Mrs. Carter shook her head. "No. Just his name and the church address." Miss Marple said nothing, though her mind quietly noted the detail. A letter without a return address was seldom an ordinary matter. Mrs. Penberry soon collected her own envelope and left the shop, but the remark about Mr. Graves lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts long after the conversation had ended. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took another of her quiet walks along the lane that curved gently around the churchyard wall. The sky had grown slightly overcast, and the air carried the soft stillness that often arrives before evening. As she approached the church gate, she noticed a figure standing near the far corner of the yard. It was Mr. Graves. He stood beside the low stone wall, holding a folded sheet of paper in his hands. Miss Marple slowed her pace slightly, though she remained partially hidden behind a row of tall hedges. From where she stood, she could see the caretaker clearly. He appeared deeply absorbed in whatever he was reading. His shoulders were tense, and he held the paper unusually close to his face, as though examining each word with careful attention. For several moments he remained perfectly still. Then he looked up suddenly. His gaze moved quickly across the empty churchyard, scanning the gravel paths and the gate. Miss Marple noticed how sharply his expression had changed. There was a nervousness in his eyes now, the sort of alert watchfulness that suggested a man who feared being observed. After a brief glance around the yard, he folded the paper quickly and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. At that exact moment, a cart rattled along the road outside the church wall, and Mr. Graves turned toward the sound. Miss Marple chose that moment to continue walking along the lane, stepping casually into view as though she had only just arrived. Mr. Graves nodded politely when he saw her. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," Miss Marple replied gently. "You are enjoying another walk, I see." "Yes, indeed." She paused beside the gate, glancing briefly toward the church tower as though admiring the view. "It is such a peaceful place." Mr. Graves gave a short nod, though his attention seemed slightly divided. Miss Marple studied him quietly. His posture was stiff, and his hand rested near the pocket where he had placed the folded paper. "You must find it quite pleasant working here each day," she said kindly. "Yes," he replied. "Very peaceful." Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on his coat pocket. "The post has been busy today," she added lightly. Mr. Graves looked up sharply. "Has it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Several letters arrived from London this morning." For a moment, the caretaker said nothing. Then he cleared his throat. "I had not heard." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Mrs. Carter mentioned one addressed to you." The silence that followed was subtle, but noticeable. Mr. Graves shifted his weight slightly and adjusted the front of his coat. "Oh yes," he said after a moment, "just an old matter." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "London letters often bring back old memories." Mr. Graves forced a faint smile. "Yes." "Something like that." Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift away from the subject after that. They spoke briefly about the weather and the condition of the church garden before she excused herself and continued along the lane. Yet as she walked, her thoughts returned repeatedly to the folded paper she had seen in his hands. People rarely read ordinary letters in such secrecy, nor did they scan the surroundings with such sudden nervousness. By the time Miss Marple reached the small footbridge near Mrs. Linton's cottage, she had begun to form a quiet suspicion. A letter arriving without a return address, a caretaker who appeared troubled by its contents, and a church door that had opened late at night. The pieces did not yet form a complete picture, but they were beginning to arrange themselves in a pattern that Miss Marple could not ignore. That evening, as twilight settled gently over St. Briarwood, Miss Marple sat beside the sitting-room window, watching the distant outline of the church tower against the darkening sky. She stirred her tea slowly, reflecting upon the small observations of the past few days. Sometimes, she had found, letters did more than deliver messages. Sometimes they reopened old secrets. And as the last light faded from the quiet village of St. Briarwood, Miss Marple could not help feeling that the mysterious letter had quietly unlocked something far older than a church door. Chapter 5. Visitors rarely arrived in St. Briarwood without attracting at least a little attention. The village was not unfriendly to strangers, but it had the quiet habit of noticing new faces almost immediately. A man stepping from a motor car at the inn, or someone pausing to study the churchyard wall, would quickly become a subject of polite curiosity among the villagers. It was not gossip in any malicious sense. It was simply the natural interest that grew wherever people had known one another for most of their lives. The matter was first mentioned early one morning at the bakery. Miss Marple had stepped inside with Mrs. Linton to purchase a loaf of bread and a small packet of currant buns. The shop smelled warmly of fresh pastry, and sunlight streamed through the wide front window onto the wooden counter. Mrs. Carter, who had left the post office briefly to collect her own bread, stood near the door speaking with the baker's wife in a tone that suggested mild excitement. "I noticed him arrive late last night," Mrs. Carter was saying. "Arrive where?" asked the baker's wife. "At the King's Arms," Mrs. Carter replied. Mrs. Linton turned with interest. "A new guest?" Mrs. Carter nodded. "A gentleman from London, according to the innkeeper." Miss Marple listened quietly while examining a basket of small rolls. "London?" Mrs. Linton repeated. "Yes, indeed," Mrs. Carter continued. "Arrived rather late as well. Nearly 10:30. The baker's wife raised her eyebrows. "That is late for our village." Mrs. Carter leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice, though the shop was nearly empty. "The curious thing is that he did not go straight to bed after arriving." Mrs. Linton looked amused. "Perhaps he was hungry after his journey." "Oh no," Mrs. Carter said. "According to Mr. Jenkins at the inn, The gentleman stepped out again almost immediately. Stepped out? Mrs. Linton asked. Yes, Mrs. Carter said. Walked directly toward the church. Miss Marple placed the roll back into the basket with calm care. Toward the church? She asked gently. Mrs. Carter nodded. That is what Mr. Jenkins said. Mrs. Linton looked puzzled. At that hour? Precisely. Miss Marple said nothing more at that moment, though the remark settled quietly among her thoughts. Later that afternoon, the mystery of the visitor deepened slightly. Miss Marple was sitting beside the window of the small tea shop on the village green when the door opened and a man stepped inside. His appearance was neat and carefully arranged, though there was something about his manner that suggested he was studying the room rather more closely than a casual visitor might. He was perhaps in his early 40s, well dressed in a dark coat with polished shoes that reflected the light from the window. His hair was neatly combed, and his posture carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to city life. He paused briefly near the door before approaching the counter. Good afternoon, he said politely. The young girl behind the counter smiled. Good afternoon, sir. Miss Marple watched him with mild curiosity as he ordered a cup of tea. His voice was smooth, though his eyes moved often toward the windows overlooking the green. After a few minutes, he carried his cup to a table not far from Miss Marple's own seat. The tea shop was quiet that afternoon, and after a moment he turned politely toward her. Lovely village, he remarked. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. It has been peaceful here for many years. The gentleman smiled. My name is Adrian Bell. I have only just arrived. Miss Marple, she replied. Are you visiting as well? Yes. I am staying with a friend. Mr. Bell nodded thoughtfully and stirred his tea. I came here to examine some historical records. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. Church records, perhaps? Mr. Bell looked mildly surprised. As a matter of fact, yes. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Many visitors find our church quite interesting. It is older than I expected, he said. Miss Marple nodded. Several centuries at least. Mr. Bell took a slow sip of tea. I understand the caretaker has served here a long time. Mr. Graves? Yes. Miss Marple studied him quietly. He has been here many years. Mr. Bell's tone remained casual. I hope to speak with him about the church archives. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. The archives? Yes, he said smoothly. Certain historical records connected to the parish. Miss Marple did not challenge the explanation. Yet something about the conversation felt slightly rehearsed, as though Mr. Bell had already prepared these answers in advance. Before she could respond further, the door of the tea shop opened again, and Mrs. Penbury entered. She immediately noticed the unfamiliar gentleman and greeted Miss Marple warmly before settling at the table beside her. Good afternoon, she said pleasantly. Mr. Bell inclined his head politely. Good afternoon. Mrs. Penbury glanced toward Miss Marple with quiet curiosity, but did not ask questions while the gentleman remained seated nearby. Instead, she waited patiently until he finished his tea and left the shop. The moment the door closed behind him, she leaned closer. Who was that? Miss Marple answered calmly. Mr. Adrian Bell. He has come from London to study church records. Mrs. Penbury frowned thoughtfully. Church records? So he says. Mrs. Penbury glanced toward the window where the gentleman had disappeared down the lane. I saw him walking near the church last night. Miss Marple looked at her. You did? Yes, Mrs. Penbury replied. Quite late. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly on the table. That is interesting. Mrs. Penbury nodded. He seemed to be examining the church wall very carefully. Miss Marple allowed a thoughtful silence to settle between them. Visitors often admired old buildings, but it was rather unusual for someone to arrive in a quiet village late at night and immediately begin studying the church. Did he speak with Mr. Graves? Miss Marple asked. I believe so, Mrs. Penbury said. At least I saw them standing near the gate yesterday afternoon. Miss Marple's mind quietly returned to the letter she had seen Mr. Graves reading. A letter from London. And now a visitor from London who appeared unusually interested in the church. Miss Marple finished her tea slowly. Sometimes coincidences occurred in small villages, of course, yet she had found that when two unusual events arrived together, they were rarely unrelated. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hedgerows, Miss Marple took another quiet walk along the lane near the churchyard. The air had grown cooler, and the sky was turning the soft gray blue that often preceded nightfall. As she approached the church gate, she noticed movement near the far end of the yard. Two figures stood beside the stone wall. One of them was Mr. Graves. The other was the visitor from London. They appeared to be speaking in low voices. Miss Marple slowed her pace slightly, remaining partly hidden by the hedgerow as she observed them from a distance. Mr. Graves stood with his shoulders slightly hunched, his posture tense. Mr. Bell, on the other hand, appeared calm and composed, though he leaned forward occasionally as if emphasizing certain points. The conversation lasted several minutes. At one moment, Mr. Graves shook his head firmly. Mr. Bell responded with a brief gesture toward the church door. Even from a distance, Miss Marple sensed the tension between them. This was not the relaxed conversation of two men discussing historical records. It was something else entirely. Eventually, Mr. Bell turned and walked slowly toward the lane, disappearing into the fading light. Mr. Graves remained standing near the church wall for several moments before finally returning inside the churchyard. Miss Marple continued walking as though she had noticed nothing unusual. Yet as she made her way back toward Mrs. Linton's cottage, her thoughts were already assembling the pieces of a larger puzzle. A secret letter from London, a stranger arriving soon afterward, a tense conversation beside the church, and a door that had opened quietly in the middle of the night. Miss Marple had learned long ago that when strangers appeared suddenly in peaceful villages, they rarely came without a reason. And as the evening shadows lengthened across the quiet lanes of St. Briarwood, Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain that the stranger's arrival and the mysterious church door were far more closely connected than anyone yet realized. Chapter 6. There is something about an old church when it stands empty during the afternoon hours. The silence seems deeper there than in any other place in the village. Even the air feels still, as though it carries the quiet memory of countless voices that have filled the space over the years. For Miss Marple, such quiet places often allowed the mind to notice details that would otherwise pass unnoticed. The following day, the village moved through its usual gentle routine. Children crossed the green on their way home from school, shop doors opened and closed, and the sound of a distant lawnmower drifted across the hedgerows. Nothing in St. Briarwood suggested that anything unusual was unfolding beneath its calm surface. Yet Miss Marple had begun to feel that the small mystery surrounding the church door had reached a point where a closer look might be worthwhile. It was shortly after luncheon when she decided to walk once more toward the churchyard. Mrs. Linton had settled comfortably in the sitting room with a magazine and a cup of tea. "You won't mind if I take a short walk?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Not at all," Mrs. Linton replied, "though I warn you Mrs. Penbury may arrive soon, and she has a remarkable talent for talking without pause." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "In that case, I shall return before she does." The afternoon air was calm and pleasantly cool as Miss Marple stepped on to the village lane. The hedges rustled softly in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a tractor hummed faintly across the fields. When she reached the church gate, she paused for a moment, glancing across the quiet churchyard. No one appeared to be there. The gravel paths lay empty between the gravestones, and the tall yew trees cast long shadows across the grass. Miss Marple opened the gate and stepped inside. The stillness was deeper here than in the lane outside. A faint smell of old stone and fallen leaves hung in the air. She walked slowly toward the church door, her shoes making soft, crunching sounds on the gravel path. The large wooden doors at the front of the church stood slightly open, as they often did during the day for visitors who wished to step inside. Miss Marple entered quietly. The interior of the church was dim after the bright sunlight outside. Soft colored light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting gentle patterns across the stone floor. Rows of wooden pews stretched toward the altar, and the faint scent of candle wax lingered in the cool air. Miss Marple paused just inside the entrance, allowing her eyes to adjust to the softer light. Churches often revealed their details slowly. One noticed a worn step here, a faded carving there, signs of long use that told quiet stories of the past. She began walking slowly down the aisle. Her pace was unhurried, her gaze moving calmly across the floor and walls as though she were simply admiring the building. Yet her attention soon settled upon something unusual. Near the side aisle, not far from the smaller door she had seen opened at night, a portion of the wooden floor appeared slightly disturbed. Miss Marple stopped. At first glance, it might have seemed nothing more than a shadow or a change in the wood grain. But when she stepped closer, the detail became clearer. One of the narrow floor panels did not sit perfectly level with the others. The edges showed faint marks, as though the panel had been lifted recently and then placed back again. Miss Marple bent slightly, examining the area with quiet interest. The marks were small, but they were unmistakable. A thin object, perhaps a small tool or blade, had been used to pry the panel upward. She straightened slowly. Church floors were rarely disturbed without reason. For several moments she stood silently, her mind moving through the possibilities. Had the caretaker opened the panel for repairs? That seemed unlikely, for there was no sign of tools or maintenance work nearby. And yet someone had clearly lifted it. Miss Marple walked a little farther along the aisle before turning back toward the door. She did not touch the panel. It was always wise to leave such things exactly as they were. Instead, she stepped outside again into the afternoon sunlight. The quiet churchyard looked unchanged. A pair of birds fluttered between the gravestones, and the breeze stirred the branches of the yew trees. Miss Marple closed the church door gently behind her. Her thoughts moved steadily now. If someone had been entering the church at night, and if the floor panel had been disturbed, then it seemed very likely that something hidden beneath that panel had drawn their attention. Perhaps a document. Perhaps a small object. Churches sometimes stored valuable historical items, especially in villages where traditions ran deep. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the gate. As she stepped back onto the village lane, she noticed two figures approaching from the direction of the green. They were speaking quietly together. Miss Marple recognized them at once. Mr. Graves and the visitor from London, Mr. Adrian Bell. The two men did not see her immediately. They stood near the church gate, their conversation carried on in low voices that rose and fell with clear tension. Mr. Graves looked uneasy. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and his hands moved restlessly as he spoke. Mr. Bell, on the other hand, appeared calm, though there was a firmness in his posture that suggested determination. Miss Marple paused beside the hedgerow, giving the appearance of examining a cluster of wildflowers while quietly observing them. "I told you it cannot be done that way," Mr. Graves said in a tight voice. Mr. Bell replied calmly, though Miss Marple could not catch every word. "It must be done soon." Mr. Graves shook his head. "This is the church. People come here every day." Mr. Bell glanced briefly toward the building. "That has not stopped anyone before." Miss Marple's attention sharpened slightly. Mr. Graves lowered his voice further. "You promised this would remain quiet." Mr. Bell responded with a short, measured reply that Miss Marple could not fully hear, though his tone carried quiet authority. For a moment, the two men stood in silence. Then Mr. Graves spoke again. "If anyone discovers what is under that floor—" He stopped abruptly. Mr. Bell's expression hardened. "No one will discover anything." Miss Marple lowered her gaze slightly, allowing the men to believe she had heard nothing at all. The conversation ended quickly after that. Mr. Bell turned and walked down the lane toward the village green, his pace steady and confident. Mr. Graves remained standing beside the church gate, staring at the ground as though deep in troubled thought. Miss Marple waited a few moments before continuing along the path. As she passed the gate, Mr. Graves looked up quickly. "Good afternoon," he said, attempting a polite smile. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple replied gently. "Lovely weather for a walk?" "Yes," he said quickly. Miss Marple paused only briefly before continuing down the lane. Her thoughts had already begun to settle into a clearer shape, a hidden space beneath the church floor, a caretaker who seemed increasingly anxious, and a visitor from London who appeared determined to obtain something that lay beneath that panel. Such matters rarely remain quiet for long. As Miss Marple reached the small bend in the lane, she glanced once more toward the church tower rising above the trees. Whatever lay beneath that floor had already drawn more than one person into secrecy, and Miss Marple could not help feeling that the quiet village of St. Briarwood was moving steadily toward a moment when that secret would no longer remain hidden. Chapter 7. In villages such as St. Briarwood, the nights were usually the most peaceful hours of the day. Once the last lamp had been extinguished and the final footsteps faded from the lane, the village settled into a deep stillness that was rarely disturbed. The hedges whispered softly in the wind, an owl might call from the edge of the fields, and the church tower stood watch over the sleeping cottages like a quiet guardian of the past. It was on such a night that Miss Marple found herself unable to sleep. There was nothing particularly troubling about the evening itself. Mrs. Linton had retired early after an enjoyable supper, and the cottage had fallen into a comfortable silence. Yet Miss Marple's mind remained gently occupied with the small details she had noticed during the past several days. The open church door, the secretive letter, the visitor from London, and, perhaps most intriguing of all, the disturbed floor panel inside the church. Miss Marple sat beside the bedroom window for a time, gazing quietly across the lane toward the churchyard. The moon had risen once again, spreading its pale silver light across the gravestones and narrow paths just as it had on the night she first saw the mysterious door open. For a long while, nothing happened. The churchyard lay silent beneath the moonlight. The branches of the yew trees swayed gently, casting shifting shadows upon the gravel paths. Miss Marple might have gone to bed then, had not a faint movement caught her eye. A figure appeared at the far edge of the churchyard. It moved slowly along the stone wall, keeping close to the darker shadows between the trees. The person paused once beside the gate before stepping quietly inside. Miss Marple leaned slightly closer to the window. Even from a distance, she could see that the figure moved with purpose, following the path that led directly toward the small side door of the church. For a moment, the person stood there, almost perfectly still. Then the door opened. The movement was careful and controlled, just as it had been on the earlier night. The door did not creak or swing wide, but slipped inward with quiet precision. The figure disappeared inside. Miss Marple watched the door close again. Her expression remained calm, though her eyes were sharp with interest. Several minutes passed. The churchyard returned to its quiet stillness, and Miss Marple began to wonder whether anyone else might arrive. It was then that a second shadow appeared. This figure approached from the opposite direction, entering through the gate with quicker, more determined steps. Even at that distance, Miss Marple recognized the outline of the man. Mr. Graves. The caretaker moved rapidly across the path and reached the church door. Without hesitation, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The door closed behind him. Miss Marple remained by the window, watching the silent building with quiet attention. The minutes passed slowly. From where she stood, she could see no movement inside the church, yet she felt certain that something important was unfolding beyond those thick stone walls. Then, quite suddenly, a sound echoed faintly across the yard. It was not loud, more like the dull thud of something striking the wooden floor. Miss Marple waited. Another moment passed. Then silence returned. The church door did not open again. Miss Marple eventually stepped away from the window and prepared for bed, though the events she had witnessed remained firmly in her thoughts. If two men had entered the church in the middle of the night, and if something hidden beneath the floor had drawn them there, then it seemed very likely that matters had now reached a turning point. Morning arrived with bright sunlight and the cheerful sounds of the village waking once again. Miss Marple joined Mrs. Linton in the garden for breakfast tea. They had barely finished their first cup when the quiet rhythm of the morning was suddenly interrupted. The garden gate swung open hurriedly, and Mrs. Penberry hurried up the path with visible excitement. "My dear Harriet," she called breathlessly. Mrs. Linton looked up in surprise. "Good heavens, Edith. What has happened?" Mrs. Penberry paused to catch her breath. "There has been quite an incident at the church." Miss Marple remained very still. "An incident?" Mrs. Linton asked. "Yes," Mrs. Penberry said. "Mr. Graves was discovered inside the church this morning." Mrs. Linton frowned. "Discovered? What do you mean?" Mrs. Penberry lowered her voice slightly. "He was found unconscious." Mrs. Linton stared at her in astonishment. "Unconscious?" "Yes," Mrs. Penberry said. "The vicar found him lying near the side aisle." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Was he injured?" "They are not quite certain," Mrs. Penberry replied, "but the doctor says he will recover." Mrs. Linton pressed a hand to her chest. "How dreadful!" Mrs. Penberry nodded eagerly. "There is more." Miss Marple lifted her eyes. "More?" Mrs. Penberry leaned closer. "The church floor has been disturbed." Miss Marple exchanged a brief glance with Mrs. Linton. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Linton asked. "One of the wooden panels has been lifted completely," Mrs. Penberry said. "The vicar says there was something hidden underneath it." Mrs. Linton looked bewildered. "Hidden?" Mrs. Penberry nodded. "Yes, though apparently it is no longer there." Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. "So whatever was beneath that panel has now disappeared?" "That is exactly what the vicar believes," Mrs. Penberry replied. Mrs. Linton sank slowly into her chair. "This is becoming quite alarming." Mrs. Penberry nodded vigorously. "Everyone in the village is talking about it." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly while the conversation continued. Her thoughts were calm but precise. During the night, 2 men had entered the church. One of them was clearly Mr. Graves. The other must have been Mr. Adrian Bell. If the hidden object beneath the floor had now vanished, then one of them had almost certainly taken it. Yet there was another detail that troubled Miss Marple even more. Mr. Graves had been found unconscious, which meant that whatever had happened inside the church had not ended peacefully. Miss Marple set down her teacup. People often assume that secrets hidden in quiet villages would remain harmless. Yet secrets involving hidden objects and midnight meetings rarely remain calm for long. As Mrs. Penberry continued recounting the excitement spreading through St. Briarwood, Miss Marple looked quietly toward the distant church tower rising above the hedgerows. The open door had begun as a small curiosity. Now it had led to a hidden space beneath the church floor, a missing object, and a caretaker lying unconscious in the aisle. And Miss Marple could not help feeling that the true mystery was no longer about what had been hidden beneath that floor. The real question now was far more troubling. Who had known exactly where to look? Chapter 8. The quiet excitement that spread through St. Briarwood that morning carried a peculiar mixture of worry and curiosity. Villages often reacted this way when something unusual disturbed their routine. People spoke in lowered voices outside the grocer's shop, small groups paused along the lane to exchange their thoughts, and nearly everyone found some reason to pass near the churchyard before the day was over. By late afternoon, the vicar had invited several of the villagers to gather in the church hall to discuss the matter calmly. It was not an official meeting in any strict sense, but rather the sort of sensible gathering that often helped quiet speculation before it grew too imaginative. Miss Marple arrived with Mrs. Linton shortly after 4 o'clock. The church hall stood beside the main building, a modest stone room with tall windows that allowed the soft afternoon light to spill across the wooden floor. A few chairs had been arranged in a loose circle, and the vicar stood near the small table at the front, speaking quietly with the village doctor. Mr. Graves was not present. The doctor had insisted he remain resting at the vicarage until his strength returned. Several familiar faces had already gathered. Mrs. Penberry sat near the window, whispering to Mrs. Weatherby. The baker's wife stood beside the door, and the postmistress listened carefully while the vicar described the events of the morning. Miss Marple took a seat beside Mrs. Linton and waited quietly. Before long, another figure entered the hall. Mr. Adrian Bell. He greeted the vicar politely and took a chair near the end of the circle, his expression calm and composed. Yet Miss Marple noticed that his eyes moved carefully around the room, measuring the reactions of the villagers. The vicar cleared his throat gently. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "As you know, Mr. Graves was discovered this morning inside the church after apparently collapsing during the night." The doctor nodded. "He has suffered no serious injury," he added. "Only a strong blow and considerable shock." Mrs. Penberry leaned forward anxiously. "Was anything stolen?" The vicar hesitated slightly. "That is what we are trying to determine." A murmur passed through the room. Miss Marple listened quietly while the conversation unfolded. The vicar explained that a wooden panel in the church floor had been lifted during the night. Beneath it had been a small compartment which had remained hidden for many years. "Hidden?" Mrs. Linton asked with surprise. "Yes," the vicar replied. "During the war, certain valuable parish documents were placed there for safekeeping." The villagers exchanged curious glances. "What sort of documents?" asked the baker's wife. "Historical records," the vicar said. "Some of them quite rare." Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on Mr. Bell. His expression remained polite and attentive, though his hands rested very still on his knees. The vicar continued. "One particular document appears to be missing." "Missing?" Mrs. Penberry exclaimed. "Yes." A silence followed this remark. Miss Marple waited until the room grew quiet before speaking. Her voice was gentle and thoughtful. "It is interesting," she said, "how certain secrets remain hidden for many years until something suddenly brings them back into the light." The vicar turned toward her kindly. "You have an observation, Miss Marple? Perhaps only a small one." The room grew attentive. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "I believe the matter began with a letter." Several heads turned. Mrs. Carter spoke first. "The letter from London?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. The one addressed to Mr. Graves." Mr. Bell shifted slightly in his chair. Miss Marple continued in the same calm tone. "Mr. Graves discovered the hidden compartment only recently. Quite by accident, I suspect, while carrying out his ordinary duties." The vicar looked surprised. "I had not realized that." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It must have been quite a discovery." She paused briefly. "Unfortunately, such discoveries rarely remain private for long." Mr. Bell's gaze rested steadily upon her now. Miss Marple continued. "Someone else learned about the hidden document." Mrs. Penberry whispered softly. "The visitor." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." She turned slightly toward Mr. Bell. "Mr. Adrian Bell arrived from London very shortly after Mr. Graves received his letter." Mr. Bell spoke calmly. "I explained earlier that I came to study church records." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly. "And that explanation would be quite reasonable under ordinary circumstances." The room was completely silent now. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "But you were not searching through the records in the vestry or the archive cupboard?" Mr. Bell said nothing. "You were searching beneath the church floor." Mrs. Penberry gasped softly. Miss Marple continued. "You already knew the document was there." Mr. Bell leaned back slightly. "That is quite an accusation." Miss Marple shook her head. "Not an accusation, merely an observation." She looked toward the vicar. The document hidden beneath the floor was not simply a church record. The vicar frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "It concerned a piece of family history," Miss Marple said. "One that connected Mr. Bell's family to this parish many years ago." Mr. Bell's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple continued. "The letter Mr. Graves received warned him that someone might attempt to recover the document." The vicar looked astonished. "A warning?" "Yes." Miss Marple spoke calmly. Mr. Graves attempted to prevent that from happening. That is why he met Mr. Bell near the church several times during the past few days. Mrs. Linton whispered softly, the conversations Miss Marple saw. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. She turned her gaze toward Mr. Bell once more. Last night, you entered the church through the side door. Mr. Bell remained silent. Mr. Graves followed you. Miss Marple's voice remained warm but firm. You located the floor panel and opened it. The villagers watched in complete silence. Mr. Graves attempted to stop you from taking the document. Miss Marple paused gently, and during that struggle he was struck and left unconscious. The room remained still for several seconds. Then Mr. Bell spoke quietly. You have constructed a very imaginative story. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Fortunately, it does not rely upon imagination. She gestured slightly toward the vicar. The church door handle was polished repeatedly over the past week because it was being opened many times at night. She turned toward Mrs. Carter. The letter from London warned Mr. Graves of someone searching for that document. Then she looked calmly back at Mr. Bell. And you arrived in the village the following day. Mr. Bell said nothing. The silence in the hall deepened. At last he spoke quietly. You are remarkably observant. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. I have always found that people reveal far more than they intend through the smallest details. Mr. Bell stood slowly. For a moment he appeared to consider speaking further. Then he gave a faint smile. It seems the matter has become rather clear. The vicar looked stunned. You admit it? Mr. Bell sighed quietly. The document belonged to my family originally. I simply wished to reclaim it. Miss Marple spoke gently. Unfortunately, you chose a rather secretive method. Mr. Bell said nothing more. The tension in the room slowly began to ease as the truth settled over the villagers. Outside the church hall, the evening light had begun to fade across the quiet lanes of St. Briarwood. Later, as Miss Marple and Mrs. Linton walked slowly back toward the cottage, the village seemed peaceful once again. The church tower stood quietly against the darkening sky, just as it always had. Mrs. Linton sighed softly. I would never have imagined such a thing hidden beneath our church floor. Miss Marple smiled gently. Old buildings often keep old stories. They reached the cottage gate and paused for a moment. Across the lane, the churchyard lay calm beneath the evening shadows. The small side door remained firmly closed. Miss Marple looked at it thoughtfully before turning toward the garden path. Even the quietest villages, she reflected, sometimes conceal the most unexpected secrets. Yet sooner or later, one small door always opens. Even after the excitement had faded, the village of St. Briarwood slowly returned to the gentle rhythm it had always known. The following days brought quiet sunshine, the soft tolling of the church bell, and the ordinary routines that had shaped village life for generations. If a stranger had arrived then, he might never have guessed that anything unusual had taken place at all. The churchyard looked just as it always had. The yew trees stood silent over the old gravestones, the gravel paths curved peacefully between them, and the small side door of the church remained closed each evening as the light faded from the sky. Yet for those who lived in St. Briarwood, the events of that week lingered gently in memory. Mr. Graves recovered steadily at the vicarage, though the experience had clearly shaken him. The villagers visited him one by one with small gifts of fruit, homemade soup, and quiet conversation. He spoke little about what had happened inside the church that night, but everyone understood that he had acted with the simple intention of protecting something entrusted to his care. As for Mr. Adrian Bell, the matter was handled quietly and with dignity. The missing document was soon returned to the church, carefully placed once more among the parish records where it properly belonged. It was a fragile piece of history, written long ago and preserved through generations of careful guardianship. The vicar later explained that the document contained details of an old family agreement connected to the land surrounding the village. Though valuable from a historical point of view, it had never been intended for private possession. Its place had always been within the quiet records of the parish. Once the document was safely returned, the hidden compartment beneath the church floor was sealed again. The wooden panel was fitted back into place, its edges carefully restored so that no casual visitor would ever suspect what had once been hidden there. Life moved forward, as it always does in villages where the past and present exist side by side. On a warm afternoon several days later, Miss Marple sat beside the window of Mrs. Linton's cottage with a cup of tea resting gently in her hands. Outside, the lane was quiet, and the distant church tower stood peacefully against the soft summer sky. Mrs. Linton sighed comfortably as she settled into her chair. "Well, my dear Miss Marple," she said, "I cannot imagine that anything so unusual will happen in our village again for a very long time." Miss Marple smiled kindly. Perhaps not. She gazed out across the churchyard for a moment, watching the sunlight drift across the gravestones and the narrow path beside the old stone wall. Villages, she knew, had a curious way of appearing perfectly calm while quietly holding the stories of many generations. Secrets sometimes rested there for years, hidden beneath ordinary routines and familiar places. Yet sooner or later, something small would shift. A careless remark, an unexpected visitor, or perhaps the quiet opening of a forgotten door in the middle of the night. Miss Marple lifted her teacup and took a slow sip, her eyes thoughtful but peaceful. For now, St. Briarwood was calm once again. But Miss Marple understood better than most that even the quietest village always kept a few stories waiting patiently in the shadows, until the right moment arrived for them to be discovered.